In the heart of a bustling African city, there stood a towering apartment complex known as Abesai Towers. It was owned by Abesai, a ruthless landlord who controlled several buildings across the city. Abesai's properties were infamous for being poorly maintained, but the rent was sky high. Despite their crumbling state, many poor families had no choice but to live in these rundown buildings. Abesai was notorious for intimidating his tenants. If someone couldn't pay the rent, he'd send his thugs to evict them immediately, often tossing their belongings onto the streets without a second thought. Late payments were met with threats, and he increased the rent without warning. He expects the tenants to be responsible for structural repairs like leaking roof, etc., and anyone who could not do that is thrown out of the house without refund of his or her money. His office, located in the top floor of Abesai Towers, overlooked the sprawling city, a symbol of his wealth and dominance. The tenants lived in constant fear, unable to speak out. They whispered stories of families who had lost everything after crossing paths with the wicked landlord. Abesai reveled in his power, knowing that he controlled their lives. He drove around the city in a shiny black SUV, backing orders on his phone and reminding people of his influence. But what Abesai didn't know was that God was watching. Beneath the concrete and steel lay ancient roots, the soul of the land. The people, though silenced, never stopped praying for justice, calling upon God to bring balance to the wrongs. One evening, after another day of terrorizing his tenants, Abesai returned to his lavish penthouse in Abesai Towers. As he fell asleep, strange things began to happen. A cold wind swept through his room even though the windows were shut. The shadows on the walls twisted into shapes that seemed to whisper his name. At first, Abesai dismissed it, thinking it was his imagination. But the next day, the tenants noticed something strange. Abesai's SUV, which usually gleamed with pride, had been covered in dust overnight. No one knew how, but it was as though it had been abandoned for years. Inside his building, lights flickered uncontrollably, and doors creaked on their own. The once intimidating landlord began to grow paranoid, hearing voices and footsteps in the empty halls. One night, Abesai woke to the sound of loud banging on his door. When he opened it, there was no one there, but a chill ran down his spine. As he stepped back, the lights in his apartment went out, and in the darkness, he saw faint, glowing figures, spirits of those he had wronged. They whispered of his greed, of the families left homeless, of the suffering he had caused. Terrified, Abesai tried to flee, but every exit led him back to the same room. The spirits encircled him, growing louder with every step. In his final moments, Abesai cried for mercy, but the spirits of the city would not be swayed. His cries echoed through the empty halls of Abesai Towers, but no one came to his aid. The next morning, the tenants found Abesai very sick, but no one knew what was wrong with him. He was taken to the best hospital and best doctors attended to him, but instead of getting better, he became worse. His family even took him to abroad, but to no avail. This continued for a long time, to the extent there was no longer money to take care of Abesai's health, and his family started selling out his properties. All Abesai's properties were sold off and he was left with nothing. The funniest part of it all was that the man who bought Abesai's tower happened to be the son of the very woman Abesai maltreated in the past. Though Abesai was later healed of his strange sickness but was left with nothing. He moved with his family to one-room apartment he rented in the outskirts of the city. He learnt his lesson the hard way. The new landlord renovated Abesai's tower and changed the name to Goodness and Mercy Zone. The rent was lowered and the fear that once gripped the tenants faded away. Though Abesai had ruled the city with fear, in the end, God of Veneja stepped in, and the power of justice brought him to his doom. Moral lesson. 1. Abesai's insatiable greed and harsh treatment of his tenants eventually led to his own destruction, showing that exploiting others for personal gain will ultimately bring negative consequences. 2. Power does not last forever. Abesai's power over his tenants seemed absolute, but in the end, the natural balance of justice prevailed. This teaches that no matter how powerful someone may seem, they are not immune to the consequences of their actions. 3. The oppressed will always find justice. 4. Karma is inevitable. Abesai's fate was a direct result of his actions. The story teaches that karma, or the idea that what goes around comes around, is unavoidable. Those who do harm to others will eventually face the consequences. Follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. Also, subscribe to my YouTube channel. God bless you.